Hi, and welcome to reInvent. My name is Caio Ribeiro Cesar, and we're here to talk about SQL Server cost optimization. We built this presentation as a team, me, Phil Atkins, Jason Volpe, and others such as Greg Cameron, in order to give you guys the insights about how to optimize the cost of SQL servers in Amazon Web Services. Let's take a look at this quote. If you don't understand the details of your business, you are going to fail. Let's see how this rings true in our conversation today. Let's take a look at the agenda. We're going to talk about optimization licensing assessment, other methods of reducing the cost of SQL Server, and also we're going to give a case study of other companies that were able to reduce the cost of SQL Server in their organization. So there are multiple ways of actually running SQL Server in Amazon Web Services. As you guys know, we have EC2 or Elastic Compute Cloud, where you can spin up servers and take care of the operational system, take care of SQL Server, patching, and so on, right? That gives us elasticity in terms of what's the storage size and extra, right? But there's another way of running SQL Server in Amazon Web Services, which is opting for RDS SQL, which is a managed service, right? Today, we're not going to focus too much on RDS SQL because we want to bring insights of how to reduce cost of SQL Server in VMs or in EC2. Let's take a look on the first topic, optimization licensing assessment. Amazon Web Services is a data-driven company. That being said, one of the things that we like to do is to gather data before we jump into any assumption, right? So the optimization licensing assessment is a program that works with data collection and analysis done by AWS and partners in order to understand how to reduce the cost of your migration. And that doesn't only apply to SQL Server, and that doesn't only apply to Windows. That applies to other operational systems and other applications as well. That is very important, though, for SQL Server because within that data collection, we're able to see how provisioned you are in your environment, and we are able to find the right sizing in Amazon Web Services. There are multiple ways of doing optimization licensing assessment. There are multiple partners to do optimization licensing assessment, such as CloudMize, CloudChump. You can also do it through Migration Evaluator. So if you think that you might opt in for optimization licensing assessment, there is a link here in the presentation that you can go and take a look and subscribe for optimization licensing assessment. One of the things that I believe it's very important in OLA is the number of cores that we are able to reduce due to the power of our hypervisor in AWS, right? Which means that the data collection is done, we're able to right size it, we're able to, of course, take a look on how that collection and the data beneath it, and then right size your instances in Amazon Web Services. That being said, let's take a look at number two. Number two is picking the right instance type. Remember back in time when you had to buy this big server with a lot of RAM, and at the same time that you were purchasing that server, it came with a lot of CPU power as well, right? So you had two choices. You would either pay for the license, because SQL Server, there are multiple ways of licensing, but the most common one is through core licensing, right? You either license through the cores, or you would actually remove the physical cores of your server in order to run your applications on that database, right? Now with AWS, you have multiple ways and options of picking the right instance type. I have customers running X1E instances, which will have a lot of memory, but a low number of cores in order to have the right sized instance for their specific environments. So it's important here in this image that the colored yellow ones, they are available in RDS SQL. The underlined ones are available in dedicated hosting. And I will talk a little bit more on why knowing dedicated hosting is important in SQL Server environments. But also keep in mind that we have multiple types of instances. We have compute optimization, we have memory, we have instances that are such as the X1E that will give you a lot of memory with a low power of CPU, a low number of cores, precisely, right? And you have options such as running an Intel or AMD and other types of processors inside Amazon Web Services. So it's very important to know and pick the right instance type for your SQL Server environment, otherwise you will be over-provisioned. Let's take a look at number 3. This feature is one of my favorite features in SQL Server, not in SQL Server, but in EC2, that helps SQL Server environments, right? I have a lot of customers in Brazil that are using this. So what is CPU cost optimization? That means that you can flip an instance that naturally has a power of, let's say, 8 vCPUs, but you can enable CPU optimization and reduce the number to 4. And let's say you have this instance with 16 vCPUs, but you want to reduce it to 12 or something like that. Why would you do something like that? Because you want to reduce the number of licensing needed for SQL Server, right? So that also reduces the costs. When we are doing the analysis with customers in order to either reduce the costs of SQL servers they already have in Amazon Web Services, or SQL servers that they are migrating to AWS, we take in consideration the CPU optimization. It's important to also say that you can also do CPU optimization in dedicated hosts, meaning that if you're flipping an instance, you can reduce the number of cores that this instance is gonna run, right? Keep in mind that in terms of EC2, the cost you pay for the total cost of the VM, of the EC2, but for SQL Server, you will reduce a lot in terms of licensing costs. Let's take a look on number 4. Licensing is key to understanding how to reduce cost in SQL Server environments. That rings true in AWS as well. So let's say you have a software assurance with Microsoft. What does that mean? That means that you can bring your SQL servers in any tenancy, either dedicated host or shared tenancy, and you also have the active-passive passive node benefit, which means that if you have an active server and a passive server, you do not need to license this passive server because you have the software assurance passive node benefit. So let's say you do not have software assurance. Does that mean you can still bring licenses from SQL Server to AWS? Yes, you can, and those are going to be running in dedicated hosting. Dedicated hosts, they're made for that, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about dedicated hosts in the upcoming slides. So what else do we have? What are the options that we have for licensing SQL servers in Amazon Web Services? We have license included, meaning that I can spin up RDS SQL, which is a managed service, and run SQL Server in there, and I do not need to worry about purchasing licenses with Microsoft because it's included in the cost, it's included in the offering. Also, I can do that with EC2 servers as well. Either, let's say, enterprise or standard editions, I can run that with license included, right? What does that mean? What is the best option for my company? There is no cookbook recipe, meaning that you can blend and have both software assurance with shared tenancy. Sometimes you don't have software assurance, you can spin up SQL servers in dedicated hosting. Sometimes you can spin up servers with license included as well. So why would I pay for license included? What are the scenarios where I would use license included? Let's suppose that you have a time to market of a project that is going to be in production for about 5 months. You have 5 months of a production environment running in there, in your SQL Server environment, right? Would you pay for a license that would cost you a lot of money and you have that for 1 year, 2, 3 years? No. What do you want is pay as you go, right? The on-demand methodology, or pay as you go and only as you consume, as you use. And that is very important because administrators, they can spin up an EC2 server, run that for 2, 3 months as your business needs, and then shut down those servers, and you're only going to pay for what you use. And the same rings true for RDS SQL as well, right? So that's why it's important to understand licensing for SQL servers, right? Are you going to bring your own licenses? Yes, if that makes sense, if that's important for you to bring those licenses, and you still have the money invested on those licenses. Otherwise, run license included with either RDS or EC2 windows. Let's take a look at number 5. This is maybe one of the most important things in migrating when you are migrating your environment to AWS. So remember when I mentioned about the OLA? When I mention about the OLA, that means that we're going to work with data in order to resize and proper size your environment, saying, hey, actually you are over-provisioned here in on-premises, and when you move that to AWS, you're going to reduce the need of hardware, right? When we do that, let's say you have an on-premise server with the power of, let's say, 4 vCPU. And then when we do that analysis to moving that to the cloud, you're going to go to an instance that has 2 vCPU. But remember that Microsoft has a rule of licensing of minimum 4 vCPUs per server. That means that if you're running production environments with 2 vCPU, you're paying 4 for license. So what is the solution for that? The solution for that is using consolidation. You're going to consolidate the databases, the smaller databases in production that you have into a single one. So in this example here, we're reducing 50% on the cost of licensing by doing consolidation. We have customers doing that already while they're doing their migrations, right? So if you're migrating your SQL Server environment to AWS, remember that you can not only proper size your environment, but you can consolidate those databases. What is the caveat on that? Of course, everything needs planning. Let's say you have a SQL Server with one version and another one with another version and different applications. You need to properly know what you are doing. You need to know what applications are supported in specific SQL Server databases that you own, and then do the consolidation, right? But that's going to save you a lot of money. Let's take a look at number 6. Number 6 is the step down of Enterprise Edition. So let's get back a little bit on time. In 2016, Microsoft released the SQL Server Enterprise Service Pack 1, which included a bunch of the standard features for SQL, the enterprise features for SQL Server. So that means that SQL Server Standard 2016 already had a lot of the enterprise features. So some customers started to doing the step down. They didn't need to pay for the licensing. Remember that the licensing of enterprise is more expensive than the standard one, right? So another thing that we can think about is in the 2019 version where Microsoft brought transparent data encryption to the standard version. So those customers that in the past they would say, oh, in my 2016, I cannot go from enterprise to standard. I cannot step down because I use TDE. Now they can, right? So consider stepping down. Consider knowing what you are using. And let's say that you don't want to step down. I don't want to do that. I want to keep my enterprise licenses. If you want to keep your enterprise license, just be sure that you are actually using enterprise licensing features. So enterprise licenses, for example, read replica, right? You can flip a lot, you can spin up a lot of SQL servers in enterprise and use read replica, which will make it faster for your applications, right? You have the SQL Server passive node benefit, where you, in software assurance, if you have software assurance on that. But if you have software assurance and you're paying for the enterprise license and it's an active passive node, the passive node you do not need to license because you have the benefit of the passive node. Also, thinking about stepping down. Let's say that you have this environment with only 2 servers. You can use, let's say, an active passive with FCI, and then use Amazon FSx as the storage for that one, right? For the Windows failover, right? So there are ways of having to know where would I step down from enterprise to standard, right? Remember, enterprise, it's when you have more than 2 servers, a lot of servers, and you want to use read replica and use those availability group functionalities. Dedicated hosting is very important because companies that do not have software assurance with SQL Server still want to bring those licenses to AWS, which means that they can still do that with SQL Server, but they need to run it in a dedicated host environment. If you have software assurance, you can still use dedicated host for your SQL servers as well. But most of the companies use shared tenancy for that. Also important, if you have Windows and you want to bring Microsoft software licenses that do not have software assurance or license mobility benefits, you can still do it, as long as the licenses are purchased prior to October the 1st, 2019, or added as a true-up under an active enterprise enrollment that was effective prior to October the 1st, 2019. EC2 dedicated hosts are recommended for customers which are bringing those SQL Server licenses without software assurance. For SQL Server without software assurance to be eligible for bring your own licenses on EC2 dedicated hosting, be sure that the version is SQL Server 2017 or a prior version. Now, talking a little bit on dedicated hosting, automation handles host allocation, instance placement, and also important, the recovery of hosts, meaning that dedicated hosting is a very good technology as well for companies running their environments of SQL Server. We also have customers running dedicated hosting with active passive node, but be sure, because if you do not have software assurance, that means that you need to pay for the passive node as well, because software assurance passive node benefit is only for software assurance. Number 8 is using block level replication. So there's one nice thing that we did here in this image that is not only about the block level replica, but if you take a look at this image, you will see that for these servers here, we actually have CPU cost optimization enabled. So we are actually paying less licenses that we are actually the core licenses. So we have 16 licenses that we are paying with the power of 16 vCPUs, but the instance naturally would have 36 vCPUs. So first of all, we're already using CPU optimization, right? Okay, keeping that in mind, remember when I said that if you have software assurance, you have the passive node benefit? That rings true in this example. So you see that the second node here has 0 licenses needed, zero cores needed to be licensed, right? Okay, so let's say you want to do a disaster recovery of that environment with active passive. You have the option of using always on availability group and spinning up a new server, but if you do that, you need to pay for that server licensing, because the passive node benefit is only for that one passive node that you have. What are the other option that you have in order to reduce the cost? That would be using block level replication. Of course, in AWS, we have Cloud Endure as a technology that could help you with block level replication. So what we do here is actually using the disk, having a copy of the disk. You're not going to use EC2 in this disaster recovery. And in this example, we have that spinning up in another region, right? And then instead of having a EC2 server in there running, we only have the disk. And let's say I need to do a failover. That means I will do a failover and create the cluster, right? Configure the cluster on the second region, and I will only spin up one server, and I will have that configuration of needing to only license the active node. So this is important if you want to reduce the cost and you don't need features such as always on availability group. Otherwise, if you are using always on availability group, remember that you only have one server node, one passive node benefit. And if you spin up a new server, you're going to pay for that server licensing. Let's take a look at number 9. Number 9 is GP2 stripping, or using the power of general purpose disks versus IO1 and IO2. So this is very important because in November 2020, Amazon Web Services released GP3. So what GP3 helps SQL Server administrators and database admins is that it brings 20% less the cost when you compare it to GP2. So on the left side, we have the example of using IO1 and IO2. And as you guys can see, IO2 we already reduced a lot of the cost of IO2, right? Provision IOPS, right? So in this example, we have here a server in Virginia with 2 terabytes of data, $286 for that server. So it's only one single disk for that server. When you take a look at the right side, we have the power of GP2. So we have disk stripping. So we have 4 disks of 400 gigs. And then let's take a look at the IOPS power. So on the left side, we have a configuration of 6,000 IOPS. And then in GP2, we have 4 disks of using stripping with the power of 1,500 IOPS. And when you take a look on how SQL Server looks at that disks, that configuration, he's going to use 6,000 IOPS, right? That is a possibility, right? But then with this new technology that was released in November 2020, you can use GP3. And GP3 is going to reduce the cost in 20%. And also, there's one important thing in GP3. You can increase the IOPS that you have without the need of increasing the size of the disk, as you had in GP2, right? So that also improves in terms of the configuration instead of using stripping. So in GP3, what you can have is a configuration of using one single disk, and you're going to pay a little bit more for the IOPS of the IOPS of 6,000, but you're going to pay around $15 for that, right? So when we compare, the cost of GP3 is going to be, when compared to IO2, is going to be around 30%. So that needs to be taken in configuration, and that's not only for SQL Server environments, right? We have customers running Exchange servers, which is GBOD, just a bunch of disks, that they're already upgrading their GP2 to GP3 in order to reduce the cost in 20%, right? Very important, that one as well. Let's take a look on number 10. So number 10, running non-production workloads on development edition. This is important for customers that have a bunch of development and UAT servers, and they need to understand that if it's not running on production, you do not need to license it. For example, development environments. For example, UAT, you're testing something. So you do not need to pay for the license of that server. So why is it important to bring that up? Because in multiple engagements with different customers, we have seen that few customers, but still some customers, they are paying standard or enterprise edition when they're running development and UAT environments. So let's think about the dev environment, the developer edition of SQL Server. It is pretty much it pretty much has all of the tooling and all of the features of enterprise edition, but should not be run in a production environment, right? So that's very important for customers that are big enterprises, that they have those split separations on dev, UAT, and production, and they need to know of what they're going to license, right? And now, a second conversation on that is that some customers, they're using different operational systems to run SQL Server, right? That rings true in terms of cost, but you need to be aware that in specific Linux operational systems, you need to pay licensing to make it highly available, right? Which you don't need in development edition, right? So it means that you could run a supported Linux operational system such as Ubuntu to run your SQL Server environment without having to pay for licensing on HA, right? All right, that being said, we have a team of solution architects and the service team inside Amazon Web Services which help it to build SQL Server Dev Fabric, which is a solution that uses Fargate in order to spin up SQL Server in Ubuntu containers so you can do unit testing. So that will help you to reduce the cost, test something which will use pretty much the same tooling that you would have in your SQL Server. And if you want to run that in production, of course, you need to do that in Windows and test it in Windows as well, or check. That's why I said unit testing, but you can run that and test it on Windows, right? That is a very interesting part. And customers, if you are using Dev and UAT, you do not need to license your SQL Server, okay? Let's take a look at number 11. Okay, since we are talking about the options that customers have for SQL Server, options such as software assurance, options such as bring your own license in dedicated hosting, and also when you're thinking about shared tenancy, can I do it or not? We think about how can we help customers to decide what they can bring and what are the options that they have, right? So that being said, Amazon Web Services released it in this year, 2020, the December, we released the SQL Server Calculator 2, which will help customers to decide how to bring those environments to Amazon Web Services, which means that it will help you to make those decisions and understand how you could bring those licenses and how you can think about provisioning your environment in Amazon Web Services. All right, now let's take a look at this example. This example is for Dell Tech. They say when we move it, SQL Server licenses to Amazon EC2, we save it 15% on SQL Server licensing costs. Additionally, when we moved our Windows licenses to AWS, we also save it 10% extra on costs. So that means that with this reduction, remember, if you're not running software assurance and you still want to bring those licenses, with this reduction, they were able to save hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? This is a Dell Tech case study, which I told you guys about, that we're going to talk about dedicated hosting on AWS and how that rings true on reducing the cost of SQL Server, which is, I believe it's very important for customers that want to bring those licenses and those workloads to Amazon Web Services. All right, so call to action. First of all, assessment, right? Knowing the optimization licensing assessment is going to help you to decide the servers that you're going to bring. And that being said, what it's going to do as well is going to help you on the right sizing of your environment. That is the most important part, right sizing, because most of the customers that they run on premises, they are over provisioned, right? So when thinking about moving that to AWS, it is a good idea to right size it so you can reduce the costs of SQL Server, mainly because we're probably going to be able to reduce core licensing as well, right? Number two, consolidation. If you have servers, as of now, they're running in production with 2 cores, you're paying for 4 licenses, right? So consolidate those databases. So when you're thinking about moving that to AWS, or even if not, but you want to consolidate, you're going to reduce the cost of licensing. Of course, that needs to be taken a look for the database administrator in order for him to understand which servers can be brought together in different DB instances inside one specific server, right? Architecture. The cost of architecture is huge if people don't know how they're properly designing the architecture, right? One good example for that is block level replica. So if you do not need a lower RPO RTO, block level replica could suit your needs, right? You don't need to pay extra for the license of the third server of your, let's say, always on availability group, right? Also, if you're thinking about doing the architecture and you know how many users are going to be accessing your application, you don't need to have always on availability group and you can work with replicas. Why would you buy enterprise? Why would you architect your environment to have enterprise edition? That's when we think about the proper architecture and stepping down, right? Licensing. Bring your own license or blend in. Blend in because sometimes you do not need to purchase a license and keep it with an agreement with Microsoft for, let's say, 1 year, or the true up, or have that agreement. That you don't want to have that. You can opt in to have a license included, either in EC2 or in RDS SQL, where you do not need to worry about patching the operational system, patching SQL Server, right? Your strategy for backups, that's going to be easier in RDS SQL, right? So licensing is very important for SQL Server. And tooling, AWS tooling, that could be the calculator that we talked about, that could be the tool that you can run inside optimization licensing assessment, the tools that are here in order to help you to properly decide how to migrate and how to build and design your SQL Server environment to AWS. Call out to some other Windows specialty sessions here. We have Win 201, which is migrating Microsoft workloads to AWS, which is important in understanding not only migrating environments like SQL, but everything related to Microsoft. So we're going to touch base on EC2 Windows. We're going to touch base on other Microsoft technologies, right? Win 301, which is the best practices for running Active Directory on Amazon Web Services. That is one of my favorites because I'm a very big fan of Active Directory in identity. And Win 302, which is managing and governing Microsoft workloads on AWS, which is a tool which is Systems Manager, how to automate, do patching and such. And Win 304, which is migrate SQL Server on AWS, which is very important for the ones that are here in our conversation. I'd like to thank you for being here. Thank you for participating on this session, and happy cloud computing.